Eric Prince leaves the SEALs, goes out to North Carolina, teams up with a group of other Special Forces guys, and together they begin building up Blackwater. The company was incorporated in late 1996, and at the beginning the original name was Blackwater Lodge and Training Center. And the idea was it was going to be a sort of sportsman's paradise. And they also indicated in early company literature that they intended to take advantage of what they anticipated to be increased government outsourcing of firearms and security-related training. Sound a little bit familiar? So they begin building up Blackwater in that image, the Lodge and Training Center in North Carolina. 97 is a quiet year as they build it up. So 98 they open for business, and then in 99 the first of what would be almost annual tragedies or incidents that would end up bringing business to Blackwater took place, and that was the Columbine shootings in Colorado in April of 1999. Blackwater responded to those shootings by erecting a mock high school on their compound, and they called it Are You Ready High? And they invited law enforcement agents from around the country to come to Blackwater and train in how to face down against the violent youth of America's schools. The next year it was the bombing of the USS Cole off the coast of Yemen, one of the most devastating, it was portrayed at the time, peacetime attacks against a U.S. vessel. A number of sailors were killed. I'm sure many of you remember that. The Navy responded to that by awarding Blackwater a $35 million contract to train sailors on how to defend their ships and vessels against such attacks. In 2000, it was under the Clinton administration when Blackwater was officially given its license to provide goods and services to the federal government. But the real money for Blackwater wouldn't start rolling in until September 11th. Eric Prince, the head of the company, is not a man who appears very often in public. When he does, it usually is at a military-oriented conference. He also doesn't give interviews that often. The most recent one was an email interview he gave with the Virginian Pilot newspaper last summer. The Virginian Pilot is right in his backyard there. But he did give at least one television interview that I know of, and that was on Fox News right after 9/11. He was on the O'Reilly Factor, and Eric Prince was brought on to talk as a sort of security expert because at the time, you remember, there was this discussion about federal air marshals. How heavily should they be armed? Should they be on every flight? It was a big discussion for a while there after 9/11, and certainly I think remains one. But Prince, in addition to talking about that, said something that was very interesting. He said, I was starting to get a little cynical before 9/11 about how seriously people took the business of security and training. Well, now the phone is ringing off the hook. And among the early calls to come into Blackwater after 9/11 was from the Central Intelligence Agency, which contracted the company to go into Afghanistan in the early stages of operations there. Eric Prince himself went over to Afghanistan with that initial Blackwater deployment. I should note at this point, Eric Prince is only 37 years old. He's a very young person to be running such a powerful company. He's been very successful over the last decade. So Eric Prince goes over with that initial Blackwater team. He remains there for a couple of weeks. What Blackwater did after that, we don't know, because contracts that are with the Central Intelligence Agency are generally covert in nature, and it's very difficult to get any information out of the CIA. But what we do know is that Blackwater would hit the serious big time when the Bush administration made the decision to invade and occupy Iraq. During the 1991 Gulf War, the ratio of active duty soldiers to private contractors was about 60 soldiers to every one contractor. The Bush administration took power with the most radical privatization agenda in the history of our country. Cheney and Rumsfeld in particular were intent on trimming that ratio down to an almost 1-to-1 ratio, which is what we have today, 145,000 active, 130,000 contractors. So when U.S. tanks rolled into Baghdad in March of 2003, they brought with them the largest army of private personnel ever deployed in a modern war zone. Now, among those tens of thousands of contractors initially deployed, many of them had nothing to do with running around with guns. They worked for companies like Halliburton or KBR or Fluor, and they did work that was traditionally the job of the active duty military. They did the cooking for the U.S. troops, the laundry, they drove trucks. But among them also were thousands upon thousands of heavily armed private soldiers, mercenaries, some of whom, or a great deal of whom, were on the U.S. government payroll. Order 17 granted a sweeping immunity to all contractors in the country from any prosecution under Iraqi law. In other words, you can walk up, if you're a contractor, to an Iraqi, shoot them in the head, and there's not a thing that an Iraqi court can do. War should be governed by rules of accountability, oversight, and law, not by the rule, what happens here today stays here today. That apparently is the motto of the contractors operating on the ground in Iraq right now, 130,000 strong. I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican or a fierce independent or a libertarian. I don't see how this system is defensible, where we have billions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer money going to fund corporations whose entire livelihoods are built off of the escalation of war and conflict. I don't see how we can have a debate in this country with rhetoric being thrown around about who does and doesn't support the troops when we support a system where armed private contractors are making more money than Secretary Gates and multiple times more money than U.S. soldiers on the ground, or a system where you have 64 courts-martial of U.S. soldiers in Iraq on murder-related charges and not a single one against the private contractors from an army that almost rivals the official army's scope and size. Among the most powerful of those companies that are operating in an armed capacity in Iraq is the one now that's moving in here to JoDavies County. To me, it's a stunning commentary on the state of open government in this country. And so I think that, above all, whether you think Blackwater is going to be a company that represents your community well, that you want to welcome it here, or you're against it for whatever reason, I think everyone can come to some kind of an agreement that whatever happens has to be done in the full view of the public, particularly of the residents of JoDavies County, that you do not let them take anything into a closed session hearing. It is undemocratic when you're talking about a major, powerful corporation coming into a small community to not get the input of every resident who has something to say. And so that's the most important thing right now, is to make sure that every step of this process has light shined on it so that everyone who will be impacted by this has a chance to say what they think about it.